Welcome to the Samuele Tini Show and our Oppenheimer Research Conference 2025 special with live and on-site conversation with African researchers and leaders turning science into solution for biodiversity, climate resilience, and livelihoods. The conference is organized by Oppenheimer Generation Research and Conservation, one of Africa's leading independent organization for African-led science. This year's theme is Preserving Our Precious Planet. We will explore biodiversity loss, landscape ecology, climate, wildlife economies, and heritage with African scientists for Africa. I am your host, Samuele Tini. Welcome to another episode of our series, giving voice to conservation and people at the forefront here in the continent. And we are going to discuss now something that is also dear to my heart, human-centered conservation, how we can put communities, the indigenous people, at the core. And we are doing this with Lessah Mandoloma, fresh PhD, University of Oxford. And then we are doing this also with Katie Mackenzie. She is the head of impact at Jamma Conservation and Community in the UK. Thank you so much, Katie and Lessah, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to know a bit more about you before digging into the concept of community and human-centered conservation. Lessah, background and how you have entered this world.
So for me, I've come from the background of ecology. So I did my undergrad and my master's in natural resource management. And then before I ventured into my PhD. But then my PhD was more interdisciplinary. I started looking at the relationship between agriculture and conservation, basically on how to reconcile food security and conservation in shared landscapes. And I was doing this in Malawi, in Kasungu National Park, with communities who live around Kasungu National Park. So that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years, actually.
Fantastic. And Katie, how you entered this world, also for you?
Right. So I'm from South Africa originally, but I left quite a long time ago. So my accent's quite confused, moved around every couple of years. And I started out actually in economics and international politics. I went into business, specifically in Australia and the UK. And then found conservation as I didn't actually realize it was a job that you could do. I always thought of it as a passion or a hobby. And I started meeting all these incredible conservationist people that had dedicated their lives to conservation and to working with people and wildlife. So decided, that was absolutely what I wanted to do. Started moving into conservation. I went and did my master's in conservation. I started working with Jamma. It was Jamma International at that point, but is now divided into Jamma Conservation Communities to really put focus on the work that we're doing on the people that are living closest to nature. And this is mainly focused in Southern and East Africa, but we also work quite a bit on projects that are similar, always connected to African context, but similar projects in Europe and North America.
Fantastic. So you've been called home in a way. And let's go a bit into your research and your work and presentation. There is a lot of discussion how to put indigenous people, community, and sometimes we find that there are a missing person, the elephant in the room in many conversations and other in conferences. So you are fostering a different approach, a human-centered conservation. Can you briefly define it, Lessah, please?
So human-centered conservation, the way we're defining it, is an approach, a framework that builds on the other people-centered approaches and even earlier frameworks in conservation. But then what human-centered conservation does is to, first of all, not just putting the communities at the center of conservation, but also have honest conversations about who defines conservation or what are the goals for conservation, who benefits from conservation, and how are these trade-offs negotiated whenever they happen. Because we realize that across different landscapes, these trade-offs will look different in different places, but how do these trade-offs negotiated, focusing on the people that bear the cost of conservation? So human-centered conservation is all about breaking the silos, also making sure that, because one of the things that we recognize in human-centered conservation is that for far too long, we've been working in silos. So you've got health on the other side, you've got climate people on the other side, and you've got conservation people on the other side. But at the end of the day, if you're go down to the communities, the reality is that these things are interconnected. You cannot separate them. So human-centered conservation it breaks these silos to look at how these different sectors are interconnected on the ground, because humans or people and nature cannot be separated. One of the important conversations that we have had in one of the presentations here, it was about redefining our relationship with nature. And that's exactly what human-centered conservation does. It redefines, or not only reimagines, but it redefines conservation. It redefines how people are related with nature. And at the end of the day, what we say in human-centered conservation is that you cannot separate people and nature. So it looks at this win-win situation where people win and conservation win. It looks at all the gains. And we realize that to have these gains, there are trade-offs that have to happen sometimes. And we communicate this, we explicitly look at these trade-offs, and we make sure how do we break down these silos while making sure that the shared responsibility of saving the earth is upon everyone, but the priority is the people who live close to wildlife.
And that is a very important. It sounds like, if I understood correctly, you are advocating for an holistic approach, because that is also why community, and also my experience with community. When you enter a community with a standing point or a donor viewpoint, then there are other interconnected areas, which they also make your intervention more effective, because you solve a problem of a community. And I really like different priorities, but putting the people at center. And how do you do this in practice, Jamma? How you can really shift, this silos approach towards a more holistic approach, especially maybe coming from the NGO world?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Lessah's completely right. I mean, you can see this when you look at the past, just how important this kind of an approach is. I mean, every Living Planet report that comes out just shows the ongoing decrease in biodiversity, despite, big successes in conservation that have been happening. And so from our perspective, we tend to look at projects mainly in Southern and East Africa, but as I said, also across the world, that show characteristics of human-centered conservation. I think Lessah mentioned before, it's taking a lot of what other people have already started. It's not trying to start the model anew. But there's been a lot of movement towards rights-based approaches, inclusive approaches, and things like specifically in Southern Africa, you get, approaches such as community-based natural resource management, CBNRM, that's looking at putting people closest to nature as the decision makers, as the people that are benefiting as well from the wildlife around them. And this is what we're trying to do across sectors. So it can't just be conservation or speaking about conservation. It needs to bring in, and Lessah mentioned it as well, it needs to bring in the talks around climate. There's so much going on in that space, looking at bringing in local people and communities, indigenous peoples into the climate conversations. Why isn't that being connected so closely to the biodiversity conservation conversations that are going around as well and are so crucial? And that's what we're looking to do amongst our projects. And that includes kind of research projects, making sure that we're bringing in other sectors, that we're bringing in other perspectives. So we have that with, one of the examples is, actually two of the examples are presentations that we're seeing at the Oppenheimer Conference this year. Some looking at, one is called the Morally Contested Conservation Project, looking specifically at how do people think about, for example, contested issues in conservation, depending on where they are and who they are. Other conversations looking at, for example, welfare implications of conservation. So bringing in these other types of sectors of conversations. And likewise, in a lot of the projects that we work in, it's bringing in concepts like food security and sovereignty. So talking to those in agriculture, looking at livestock, how do we bring the conservation conversation there as well? So we work specifically in Southern Africa specifically. We work on a number of different, they're called anchor sites, in collaboration with Life Through Wildlife. And these anchor sites are looking at community owned land, so that have wildlife on them, and making sure that communities have the resources, the capacity, and that they do want, to be part of the conversation and to have the opportunity to manage these lands, have the resources to manage these lands themselves, not having to rely on others or NGOs or people from around the world who often don't have the best interests of those people at their heart. They're thinking about their donors who are often on the other side of the world to actually have the decision-making power and have the data, have the governance systems in place to be able to make those decisions across all sectors.
And this is a very interesting. I mean, we are preaching to the converted because this is the approach and discussion. But I want to I want to go a bit deeper on that. From your research, how this has, and she mentioned just Katie, two findings toward the anchor cell. How does it look in practice? What are you really doing there? And also, which are the impacts that you have witnessed with your approach?
As Katie has mentioned, different projects that Jamma Conservation Communities throughout the human-centered conservation partnerships, implementing various projects on the ground. So what human-centered conservation does is we have a set of foundational principles, right? So the principles will include things like looking into the local leadership, equity and rights, those kind of things on the ground. So we start, for example, if you're looking at the research side of human-centered conservation, then it's starting from defining the kind of research that you want to do. So it means you're co-developing your research with the communities as well, because in that, you're recognizing that it's not about capacity, in as much as other places do need capacity building, but it's also redefining what capacity building means, because in other circumstances, it's about capacity sharing. So capacity, you as a researcher, you come from a very different perspective than the communities that you're working with. So how are you sharing the capacities within your research? That relationship, is it an equitable relationship? Do you think communities are free to talk to you about research, or they're basically telling you what you want to do? So the redefining starts from there. You're redefining the research goals themselves. Even the way you're conducting with the community, is that respectable? Are you respecting the culture of the people around that community? And then you collect the data, or how is the data collection being done, for example? Are you just looking at the communities as data collectors or as partners? So that relationship there, it matters a lot. It looks at how are you looking at the communities? How is the interest of the communities, or how are the communities defining and redefining your research? And that, again, it's not very easy to do on the ground because there are different enablers, right? You need to have flexible funding. You need to recognize the institutional barriers that are there. So you keep those things in mind. But again, as I said before, human-centered conservation is also about breaking the silos. So it's recognizing that you cannot do this alone. So it survives on collaboration. So you collaborate with the funding agencies, you collaborate with government, you collaborate with NGOs, you collaborate with the communities all together, recognizing that it is difficult to do this with just one person or as a researcher. It's very much interdisciplinary in nature, but also very much collaborative as well. Because at the end of the day, every stakeholder will have their own role to play. The communities will have their own role. The NGOs will have their own role. So at the end of the day, it's not about competing anymore. It's about sharing the knowledge, sharing the resources, and making sure that you're all having the same agenda and everybody benefits from that research. Because at the end of the day, you will need policy to be informed by that research. But if you're involving the people responsible for the policies in the research from the beginning, then it will be very easy. Again, one of the things that is very unique about human-centered conservation research is also the fact that you do your research, but you go back to the communities. You discuss that research. There's so many things that can come out of the research, but sometimes as a researcher, you might not know why you're getting those results. So you go back to the communities. You interpret the results with the communities. This is coming out like this. Why do you think this is the case? Then you'll be surprised at how much information that is going to come out of there. You report, this is what we did, and these are the results. And this way of doing things, we have seen communities coming back to us saying, oh, we've never had this before. We know researchers come, they do their research and they go.
Exactly.
And it was very surprising to see that. But then that's the thing about humans. Yes, human-centered, because it's recognizing the other person as a human.
Yeah.
Before anything else. We are all here. We are all in this space because we want to do better for the environment. We want also to do better for the communities. And it starts with us changing our perception. What is humanity? Human-centered conservation is a call to reimagine and to transform conservation from the humanity perspective, recognizing that humanity is about nature as well.
And this is a changing approach from the fortress approach or other approaches that they are more saying humans are just agent of destruction. Let's remove them and everything. So it's just we have also we are a problem in many areas.
Yes,
but we can also be a part of the solution.
Exactly,
absolutely. And I think you can't separate human-centered conservation from the rights as well of those who are living so close to nature and being able to actually have the agency to make decisions as well. Because it's so many times, I think people who live closest to nature, especially by many conservationists, are expected to protect the wildlife, but not given actually any incentives or power to do so.
Exactly. And that is the contradiction that sometimes is there. And it's easy maybe to say it from a position of privilege or a position from the global north or others, but when you're on the ground at the grassroots level, no, that's where the holistic perspective is what creates better results. But of course, you take in consideration what the community, the people are living in there, and they understand the places. And do you see this approach becoming an approach that can be replicated and replicable to other intervention and can really solve, the contradiction, as I was discussing before, on how to foster the climate crisis, but foster the conservation crisis on the issue towards instead and solve the problem, but also, respond to the rights of development, the rights of a growing population, and the aspiration, especially for the emerging of future markets, like the one we are sitting at.
Yes, I think the aim of human-centered conservation is always to be an implementing approach. It needs to be practical. It can't just be a high-level theory, because these ideas aren't new that we're talking about. It's being discussed we were just at the IUCN World Conservation Conference last week. These topics are being discussed, and the language is there, the feeling is there, but so often it's being discussed in very high level forums. It's not being looked at as proper implementing approach. And it's so important to be able to understand ways that this can be done. I think it's so difficult to think of it as, if a model works, let's just replicate it exactly somewhere else, because in so many of these cases, it's very different locations, it's very different contexts. What we can do is take the lessons learned from sites, and then we can adapt it and work in other places, which we have found success. And what we'll be looking with human-centered conservation is to take criteria and metrics to get into, Lessah describes it really well, but this fourth quadrant where we've got you can have social impact, but no environmental impact. You have environmental impact, no social impact. You have no social impact, no environmental impact. How do we get to the area where we've got real social and environmental impact? And with projects who are wanting to work in a human-centered conservation way, they are, and these are currently being developed as well, but the metrics and criteria to understand, okay, well, what makes this human-centered conservation, what you're currently doing, and how can you improve on that? And where are the areas and the specific pressure points that you can work on to make sure that this is benefiting both people and wildlife?
And that is such an important area. And I want to close a bit with maybe an advice for people, especially that are listening, especially in the African context. How we can foster more of this, how we can approach that, how we can really change the perspective within conservation.
Looking at the areas that were more similar rather than focusing on our differences. We do have to embrace diversity. Diversity is very important. And that's why in human-centered conservation, we do away with one-size-fits-all scenarios, right? Recognizing that different places have a different context, different places, different approaches. But to also the larger extent, we also look at what are the similarities among us, because that's what brings together in the first place. So us focusing on our differences creates divides. And that's why we've been here. That's why we've had less success than where we are, because we put ourselves in these little boxes. Oh, this one is from the global north. This one is from the global south. Oh, we're different in that way. Yes, we are different. And that diversity is very much important. No doubt about that. But we also have so much similarity within us. And focusing on that similarity, that's where equitable relationships start happening. Because the minute you're saying, oh, that one, us over them or this one over that, then it creates more divide, more cracks. Then we'll never get there, because for us to do human-centered conservation, or for us to reimagine conservation, we need to work together. We need to collaborate. We don't have to work in silos anymore. We need to collaborate more. We need to talk to each other more. We need to relate better with ourselves and with nature. And it starts with us looking at ourselves. What are they? So what do you and I share? We all want we want all better things for livelihoods, for nature. It starts there. So I guess looking at the relationship that we share with each other and the relationship that we share with nature, embracing our commonalities, but also recognizing that we're different.
And so thank you for this message. It's a message of hope. There's more that unites us than divides, especially in this very polarized and crazy world. So thank you so much, Lessah. Thank you so much, Katie, for coming to the post and sharing your very insightful
Thank you.
result.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.